So during your research, what have you found out from?
So we began this research back in July of 2022, where we had noticed that anti-Hindu memes, slurs, and code words were increasing all across the internet. And we had looked at several social media platforms where we saw a rise in all of these slurs and these memes that had very openly violent and genocidal ideologies that were targeting the Hindu community was on the rise. And we had warned that this would actually pose a challenge to real Hindu communities that were living in North America, specifically today, given that we saw the origin of these posts were mostly within the United States. And what we had found is that right after we published the report, there was a rise in anti-Hindu attacks that happened all across North America. It actually began with a man standing outside of Representative Pramila Jayapal's home who had shouted some of the same slurs and derogatory comments against Hindus that we had been noticing within our report. And this is extended to several other cases that have been recognized all across the United States.
Do you have some specific cases where Hindus have been attacked?
Yeah, like for example, Representative Jayapal's one is a example, but another one that actually where we saw the kind of slurs that are weaponized across in another country, for example, is in Leicester, where we had seen that Hindus were basically targeted and using social media platforms. So we saw that several bad actors were weaponizing on anti-Hindu conspiracy theories and weaponizing social media to instigate cyber social swarms where hundreds of thousands of individuals were tagged on Instagram posts, posting Instagram stories, calling for mobilizations that resulted in real-world rioting that occurred against the Hindu community. And what we saw in the cyber social domain during this time was that the type of slurs were rising at the same time that these attacks were actually taking place.
And where are these coming from? Where are these originating from? Who are behind this?
So in Leicester, very specifically, we saw two things. First is that these anti-Hindu violent inciting messages, they were coming from mostly British Pakistani Islamist circles. And what we had also seen is that there was a rise in anti-Hindu and also anti-Muslim bots that were used during this entire Leicester issue, where we saw that there were anti-Hindu bots that were disseminating messages suggesting that Hindus are the perpetrators of violence, and the exact same thing was true for anti-Muslim bots. So you see that this is also, there's a role of coordinated inauthentic activity when it comes to inciting violence against various communities.
And how do you address this?
That's a great question. So I think that whenever we take a look at this from a trust and safety standpoint, is that social media companies need to be aware of when their platforms are actually being used and abused in this context to incite violence against various communities. When we took a look at the coverage when it came to the Leicester issue, we saw that several large media outlets had actually platformed individuals who had been responsible for spreading a lot of the malicious narratives. What we recommend in this case is that trust and safety teams are closely monitoring social media platforms and actively checking for incitement to violence, and along with law enforcement doing the exact same thing. We saw that police were actually very instrumental in debunking a lot of the malicious narratives that were prevalent across the internet. But that being said, there also needs to be efforts to look at open source intelligence that can be gathered to take a look at what are the types of malicious narratives are they spreading and what kind of potential harms do they pose to real communities on the ground.
What's the message to the young Indian American students or Hindu students? How to be aware of those campaigns that's going against them?
So what I would say is that there are a lot of students who are interested in STEM or interested in any kind of STEM related field. But what a lot of people may not really realize is that there is a way to combine multidisciplinary studies using STEM and also passions for various other subjects. So for example, I was told a lot about history growing up, but that doesn't make me a historian. That just makes me someone who is interested in these issues. In a similar way, I do believe that Hindu students can actually look into other social science disciplines and combine that with their passions for STEM to actually create multidisciplinary studies on how we could actually use all of these theories in social science in these specific STEM fields, and how can we actually make the internet a much safer place.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.